I'm Naomi Fontanos. I'm the Executive Director of Gender and Development Advocates, Filipinas. We're an LGBTQI rights advocacy organization led by trans women in the Philippines.
And the organization is called GANDA.
Ganda Filipinas, yeah.
Yes, okay. I am so very sorry that we meet under these circumstances. How are you doing, and how is the Filipina trans community doing in the wake of this pardon and release?
It's been an exhausting last 2 weeks since we have been organizing protests both online and offline right after the pardon was given, and even before, because before the pardon, uh, the local court in Olongapo City, where the crime happened, was set to release him earlier than his 10-year uh, full jail term. So we were all anticipating to do a series of protests against that court decision. But then the pardon happened. And so I think for now, everyone is just stunned. Like when someone does violence to you, your first instinct is to freeze and be immobilized. So this is how we've felt ever since the pardon was granted. It was truly a violence against the trans community, not only here in the Philippines, but beyond. So uh, the fight is not over. We will continue to resist, especially the maneuverings of this administration to render invisible the visibility that Jennifer Laude's case brought to our community, and to render moot the little victory that Jennifer Laude's legacy has left, which is to convict and jail for the first time in history an American serviceman who has committed a crime in Philippine soil. So we will continue to tell her story. We'll continue to use her story as an example of the treachery of this government and how we have all fallen victim to its authoritarianism, its tyranny, and its fascism.
I can
But as
imagine.
well, also an opportunity for us to uh, continue our advocacy as socialist feminists who are, interrogating systems of oppression not only on the basis of class, race, or ethnicity and gender, but as well as on the basis of imperialism and colonialism. Because really, this case is such an embodiment of our intersectional feminist politics. Everything that we are fighting against is captured by this case. That here you are, you have a trans woman, a victim of gender inequality, of gender-based violence, racism, also a victim of the capitalist economic system that has kept her poor and uh, made her family poor. And now you cannot deny how the continuing imperialism of the United States in the Philippines also plays such a large role and casts shadow, a dark shadow over this case. And that is really the legacy of American colonialism in the Philippines. And I really hope that many people who will see this will realize that while your country is now undergoing a reckoning with its racist history, you should extend this reckoning to the former colonies of the US empire, because it's still winning here in our islands, even 30 years after we have kicked out the American bases. And we actually just marked the 29th year on September 16, when our Senate voted not to renew for another 10 years the stay of the US bases in the Philippines. But that symbolic victory has been uh, also disrespected through this pardon. It's as if our president is saying that in the end, the Americans still are winning and are still interfering in our local politics and governance.
It's it's so powerful. I mean, it feels to me so as a Black person in the US, it feels to me so much like this coming together of Black Lives Matter, and coming together of Black queer lives matter, and of Black trans lives matter, and all that beginning to really fold into a larger movement. And I think what I hear you saying is that the movement to liberate trans women in the Philippines is really now come to a much deeper link with the whole larger democracy movement, the resistance against Duterte, the resistance against US imperialism. How is that working and manifesting on the ground, that linkage with the movements? Are you,
Of course, when you have an issue like this where it uh, cuts across so many issues uh, and involves several actors in the social justice movement, you will also realize that some voices are left out. So we have, as much as possible, tried to engage as trans activists of color in this conversation, because really, trans people are the last to be heard in this issue. And so you will have people who are commenting on this issue and focusing on just one aspect of it. So, for example, in the last 2 weeks, we have heard so much about the fight against uh, genuine sovereignty. We have heard so much about the unequal relations of power between the Philippines and the United States. And we have heard so much about the evils of the American military industrial complex and the machismo of the military and as an imperialist arm of the American regime. And so, who has not been heard? The trans people who are saying that what killed Jennifer Laude, apart from poverty and militarism, was transphobia. But of course, we don't want to individualize the crime um, at this at this level, and but we also don't want people to forget the reality of transphobia in this case, and it was also racist transphobia, because the perpetrator of this crime is a young white male American, and so you have really racist, misogynist, anti-woman, tra- and transphobia at work here, and that has been uh, left out in many of the conversations. And what we have been trying to say is that we must recognize the transphobia that operates in this case, but also remain mindful of the power structures that enabled this crime to happen, and that's uh, capitalist, uh, the capitalist economic system and and also the imperialism of the American military. And so it is quite ironic for a trans woman of color in the Philippines, that's a former colony and remains a new colony of the United States, that in the US you have a conversation about fighting the trans ban in the military. But as trans people, you must realize that if you want to serve in your military, you are serving the imperialist interests of the US. And then, as trans people, you become agents of violence, you become agents of imperialism, capitalism, and racism, even if you're a person of color and trans and want to serve in your military. And that is why it has been very clear to us that we should, as trans people, unpack our relationship with traditionally macho institutions like the police and the military, because these are all institutions of imperialism and violence and racist capitalist violence in your country and outside of it.
I'm reminded of Muhammad Ali when he was resisting the draft during the Vietnam era, saying, "No Vietnamese ever called me a N-word," you know, and making those linkages and making those linkages about power internationally. Those things are, that's so important for us as an international queer movement, isn't it?
Yes, and to deepen our analysis as well, I mean, as trans people, because why is the military such a viable option for many trans people in the US? It's because of the structures that keep us poor.
Class. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so therefore, sometimes we are left without a choice. But is it really a choice that will benefit our communities in the long run? Or are we just propping up institutions of oppression, right? And so now, look at the turn of how the conversation has turned out. You are being left out in the cold by the same institution that you want to be part of. So it's time to wake up and not cooperate in our oppression.
What are the next steps? What are you planning your strategy from here with the organizations in the Philippines around these issues?
So as you know, there was a documentary that was created that put a spotlight on this issue. It's called Call Her Ganda. And if people are interested, they can go to the website callherganda.com and see where they can try and catch the film. So they will be apprised of really what happened before, during, and after the trial. But in terms of advocacy work, we have been working with our feminist allies, our allies in the anti-imperialist movement, and other social justice movements to keep on advocating for genuine justice in our country. Because in spite of the fact that Pemberton was convicted, we have always believed that it was only partial justice because he was charged with murder but was convicted of homicide, which is a degree lower. And then he was supposed to serve 12 years. Then it was commuted to just 10 years. And then now he's been pardoned. And so this is clear proof of the widespread injustice that trans people and trans communities face in the Philippines and elsewhere. And that is why the fight to make trans lives matter, to say that trans lives are important, not only in words, but also in deed and in action, will continue because with this case, the message is clear. A trans life does not matter, especially a trans person of color's life, because this is what the pardon means, that in the end, if you are white, you're male, and you're American, you can get away with murder outside the US and in the US as well. So, as trans activists, while we are fighting transphobia, gender inequality, trans misogyny, we should also join the fight against capitalism, against the evils of racism, against the evils of imperialism, the evils of patriarchy, because these are all structures of oppression that we continue to face in the Philippines and in the US as well. And so our analysis must be clear, our analysis must be sharp, and we must not end up becoming double agents of the patriarchy, where we are standing up for our communities as trans people, and yet we are also supporting traditional institutions of oppression like the police or the military in both our countries. And we must anchor our activism in the social realities and the history of our people and find commonalities to fight all these systems of oppression that we are we are facing as trans people, as people of color in the Philippines and in the US. There is an Indian writer, Arundhati Roy, who addressed, I think, the World Economic Forum in 2003. And she was talking about how to confront empire. And she said, it's important to lay siege to empire. That is what our work must focus on, to lay siege to empire.
Naomi Fontanos, I could talk to you all night.
Same here, Lucia.
We could talk all night and all day. And I hope that as we continue to comprehend how, while we have different, in our international queer movement, we have different countries and different systems and different cultural factors that we deal with in all of our different, regions. The basic things of patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism, those things stay true throughout. That's the true line. And if we can hold on to that in our understanding of our international movement, there's nothing that can stop us. Nothing.
I agree. And we must thank our Black feminist foremothers for making this analysis for us so early in their fight for equality and human rights and social justice. We owe our Black feminist foremothers for such a sharp critique of our social realities. And this analysis remains true to this day.
And you might say that we came to it early in our movement, but that was after hundreds of years.
Yes, that is true.
Of processing and understanding and coming to those conclusions. And so I think, with all that we're looking at in the world right now, we're in a good place in our evolution.
There is hope. I agree.
Hope.
And that is the thing that we shouldn't lose, especially in these dark times.
Yes.
In your context, it's very important because you have just lost an advocate of equality in the Supreme Court bench, and you are also facing a presidential election. And so all these things are connected with each other. But sometimes I find that, well, maybe unlike you, most Americans are quite parochial in their thinking, and a lot of friends in the US actually have no idea of the history of US imperialism in the Philippines. And so this story has to be told, and people in the US have to be constantly reminded that your problems are not only in the US, they extend elsewhere. And you
Yes.
must also be aware of the the things that your government does outside your country. And your government is known to oppress communities of color as well outside
Mhm.
of US borders. Yes, and we must continue to resist.
Resist.